would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place and elders both past and present. I also acknowledge those whose ongoing effort to protect and promote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures will leave a lasting legacy for future elders and leaders. A very warm welcome to everyone that has taken the time out to join us to the launch of this ISRM Global Cybersecurity Special Interest Group, aligning cyber resilience with business presilience. As you'll see in a minute when we hear from David, there's no better association for our group to partner with other than the ISRM. We can see from the turnout today that cybersecurity is a topic that calls for people like us to do our part and collaborate from wherever in the world we are to make a meaningful difference in the environments in which we operate. Let's dispel the myths that you must be technically minded. Let's dispel the myths. Let's dispel the stereotype that cybersecurity is a crime. Cybersecurity, like many other facets of our lives, is a risk, and it needs to be given the due attention. We don't need to be a CFO to understand financial risk. We don't need to be a fire marshal to understand the dangers of fire. And we don't need to be a cyber expert to understand the dangers that cyber risk imposes on our personal lives, our work lives, and our virtual lives. Cybersecurity is a team sport that we all need to play. I'm going to take you through the outline of the next hour that we're going to share together. We're going to hear from the ISRM Executive Director, Dr. David Rubens, followed by the ISRM ANZ Chair, Dr. Gav Schneider, and then I will then run through the outline of the Cybersecurity Special Interest Group and what we aim to achieve. And then we'll hear from our three expert panelists, where we enjoy a fireside chat, which I'm really looking forward to. And then we'll close off in just under an hour's time. So let's get into it. David Rubens, Dr. David Rubens, where the hour is now 6 o'clock in the morning, where he's dialing in from in the UK. So David, a big thank you for getting up that extra bit early this morning to join us and be here with us. David holds a doctorate in security and risk management from the University of Portsmouth, writing his thesis on alternative command and control frameworks for strategic management and critical decision-making in complex crisis environments. Mindful of the time, I could go on, but David has been instrumental with his support in assisting to get this Cyber Security Special Interest Group off the ground. David, over to you.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you to everybody. Good morning from London, good evening where you are in the Southern Hemisphere. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for this. It's great to see this cybersecurity SIG being launched and having its first event. As you say, Dave, cybersecurity is part of the oxygen that we live in, isn't it? It's part of the environment we're operating in. Nobody can be divorced from the issues and the impacts and the significance of cybersecurity. It seems to me that every 3 months I come onto a ISRM Australia, New Zealand chapter event and say, congratulations, you've once again pushed the boundaries back. My congratulations to Dr. Gavriel Schneider, chair of the Australia New Zealand chapter, and my thanks. We launched the chapter in October 2019, and since then the Australia New Zealand chapter has led the world in multiple programs and initiatives. You have just launched the journal, the international journal, the global journal. Congratulations! And once again, you have taken the lead in setting up this program, which brings together so many strands of the security world we're living in. Thanks to the panelists for giving up their time. Thanks to the global audience, and I'm very much looking forward both to the conversation today and to seeing what the cybersecurity SIG can do moving into the future. Thank you to everybody. Back to you, Dave.
Thanks, David, and again, thank you for all the support that you've given us in getting this off the ground. Next, we have Dr. Gav Schneider, who's as I mentioned earlier, the chair of the ANZ chapter of the ISRM. and the Group CEO of the Risk to Solution group of companies. Gav too holds a doctorate in criminology and is the creator of the concept of Presilience and an acknowledged leader in the field of business risk and opportunity-based decision-making. He's one of the very few to make the ISRM Global Influences and Security Thought Leadership Top 20 for 4 consecutive years, ranging from 2019 to 2022. Again, mindful of our time constraints, I could go on speaking about Dr. Gav, but Gav, over to you.
Thanks, Dave, and thanks for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I think the timing is opportune. If we look at the news cycle in Australia, it's dominated by cyber attack and the consequences thereof. And while historically the concept of cyber risk seems to have been something that only technical experts had to worry about, it's certainly something that the general public, at least in Australia now, has become very aware of, and the risks and the consequences that result from data breaches have become all too real for too many people. So I think part of our mission with the ISRM is to try and make sure we bring together subject matter experts, thought leaders, academics, and make knowledge on how to tackle evolving risk and challenges accessible to everybody. And I believe never before has this been quite as important for everyone, and we need to concentrate on not just catering to the cybersecurity expert who is facing a myriad of challenges in a fast evolving threat landscape that changes quicker than most of us can keep up with. But the real challenge is, how do we empower everyone everywhere in all ways to manage the risk that is part of everyday life in this complex world we live in? So Dave Rubens, thank you for joining us from the UK. Dave Cohen, thank you for taking the initiative to set this up. And hopefully we can carry on the mission of trying to bring everyone together to tackle these challenges and difficult issues that will continue to evolve and will continue to make business and personal lives in our virtual world more complex as we evolve and adapt. Over to you and over to our panelists. Looking very forward to this great session.
Thanks, Gav, as always, for your instrumental leadership in the ISRM in ANZ. Now, as we unpack what was the purpose and what was the motivation and what was the inspiration behind setting up a global platform. So I've always believed that Australia is about 6 years behind more advanced nations when it comes to cybersecurity. That was what I like to call a swag, a scientific wild ass guess. And yesterday, the Australian Minister of Home Affairs and Cybersecurity, Claire O'Neill, actually announced it in Parliament. And she claimed that Australia is 5 years behind more mature countries, and some countries even worse than that when it comes to the maturity of cybersecurity in Australia. The global bar needs to be raised to reduce the gap between threat actors and our maturity to prevent successful breaches. That gap, unfortunately, at the moment is, and one of the things that I'm going to be addressing with our panelists in just a minute, is that gap widening or is that gap reducing? We seem to think that that gap is reducing. That gap is actually widening. I beg your pardon. Less mature nations need to leverage on the more mature nations to build that resilience, cyber resilience, resulting in presilience, which is essentially the concept of creating an opportunity out of risk. There's an alarming stat that came out of the UK earlier this week that mentioned 30% of cybersecurity professionals are leaving the industry. Now, that to me seems a bit like running the bathwater with the plug out. We're on this massive drive to encourage more cybersecurity professionals to enter the industry, yet we're not protecting the ones that are leaving. And the reason cited for professionals leaving the industry is stress, long working hours, and the pressurized environment that cyber professionals are working under. We can't have that. We need to be growing that gene pool and not allowing the brain drain to continue. What we aim to achieve on the Cybersecurity Special Interest Group is to create a forum bringing together like-minded cybersecurity and risk professionals authorities, academic students, and all interested parties. The aim of the group is to broadly share opinions, policies, experiences, with the ultimate objective of increasing awareness to the degree of affecting a call to improve cyber maturity across all sectors of business on a global platform. Now, the part that I've been excited about most, and I get the pleasure of now introducing our panelists. So our first panelist that I have the pleasure of introducing is Anusha Mushtaq, who is the National Account Director for Defense and Federal for Next DC. Anusha is an accomplished public speaker and writer, and she regularly speaks at national security conferences, and her work appears in major national newspapers and security industry publications. Next, we have the privilege of welcoming to the panel Eden Winoka, who is a partner and head of cyber at Hall & Wilcox, and Eden specializes in cyber, privacy, disputes, and insurance. Finally, from Manila, we have the pleasure of welcoming Prashant Haldankar, who is the co-founder and chief information security officer of Securo. Prashant is specifically skilled in ISO 27001, PSI DSS, IRAP, and IT service management, risk management, and IT strategy. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. Thank you for giving up your time, and I look forward to the next few minutes that we are going to spend together. If I can speak, let our audience know, our Q&A box is open. This is a session for you. This is to provide you with information. This is a session to give you what you need to take out of this webinar. So please feel free, to our valued audience, please feel free to populate the Q&A box with questions, and I will address them as we go through the next little while of our session. Without further ado, let's kick off and start our discussion. So I'm going to kick off and pick on Prashant, if you don't mind. Prashant, what do organizations need to do to protect individual data they gather about us in light of the specific cyber breaches that are dominating the media at the moment, more specifically to Optus and to Medibank?
Thank you, Dave. Hope you can hear me well. Thank you for the introduction and glad to be here, everyone. Yes, I'm based in Manila at the moment, but I reside in Sydney. So talking about international collaboration, I'll touch upon that in a second as well. But yeah, I mean, not jumping on the bandwagon so much with Optus and Medibank, but overall, I think many organizations now in this digital era are going through the digital transformation, as we say. And in between that, there is cybersecurity to address as well. So if you look at drawing a Venn diagram between both the digital transformation as well as the cybersecurity, in between there is something called business resilience, and that's the topic of today. I think organizations need to focus on what the critical risks that are impacting for their business, what they do with the data that they collect for their business, and where the end users are involved. And then if you treat them as crown jewels, they need to understand how these crown jewels are stored, processed, transmitted within the organization, and according to that, using a cost-benefit analysis, take a call as to what is beneficial for the organization, what is beneficial for the customers, end users, and accordingly come up with cybersecurity requirements. Obviously, when we talk about business resiliency, the controls, etc., are not going away. In fact, there is more emphasis on it. But having said that, Optus Medibank is just one example, and these incidents are not the last ones. What organizations need to focus on in terms of resiliency, and when we talk about resiliency, it's more how organizations can bounce back in this digital era by all these setbacks and impacts. Organizations need to focus on how they can continue operating with their business model and keep transforming as the cybersecurity threat landscapes keep evolving. And more to that, I think it's the cybersecurity culture within the organization has to uplift on an ongoing basis, because these things are never ending. It just basically keeps evolving as we go. So those are the key factors I would say, David, that organizations need to be mindful of. Again, keeping business resiliency in focus.
Thanks, Prashant. And that follows on quite nicely to following on from that. Even if I could bring you into this piece over here now, from a legal perspective and looking through this from a legal lens, what, you know, it's come to the fore that organizations are keeping data that they don't necessarily need to be keeping, and they keep in terms of the type of data that they're keeping, but also organizations are keeping data way past their sell-by date that they don't need to be keeping. So customers, for example, and let's just deal with the elephant in the room. So customers that were Medibank or Optus clients from many years ago, that they have no reason to necessarily keep those records, if that is the case or if that isn't the case. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, I'm using that as an example. But what from a legislative perspective, what can we do to protect this and to enforce this? Do we need more legislation? Do we need more protections? Do we need more compliance? What's your take on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Thanks for having me on and being here to be part of this great launch. But before I answer that, I just wanted to sort of add on one last bit to what Prashant has said about sort of preparedness, and that is it's really important to have all the systems in place that were just mentioned. I would add to that it's really important for companies to actually test their systems, really run attack simulations, tabletop exercises, and put the plans that are in place under testing environments to really see how they perform. So I just add that. I think it's a really important thing that I've been talking with a lot of clients about at the moment. Sort of my line at the moment is failing to plan is planning to fail. And so I really encourage people to prepare and run practices. Dave, coming to your question directly for me as the lawyer on the panel, you know, do we need more legislation and you know, or regulation, and how will that improve things? My answer to that is it's never about more or less legislation. It's about good legislation. That's really the key. We need to have good legislation, and then that leads to the next point, which is, well, do we have good legislation in Australia? So I think the starting point that we need to look at is, well, what is the current law when it comes to the way that companies retain data? And the main law that we have in Australia in relation to data, well, it comes from the Privacy Act, and in the Privacy Act there's what's called the Australian Privacy Principles that really governs the way that Australian organisations deal with data and personal information. And the really important one that we're here talking about today is APP 11. And APP 11 does two things which I think are really relevant to the current climate. The first thing it does is it requires organisations to take reasonable steps to secure personal information from misuse or unauthorised access, and a bunch of other things, but they're the sort of main things. So every organisation has this legal obligation to, that as long as the Privacy Act applies, and there's some carve-outs, but I won't get into that. There is an obligation to take reasonable steps to secure. So again, all the things that we were just talking about. Then the second part of APP 11 says that companies need to destroy or de-identify data, personal information, when it's no longer needed for the reason it was collected. So the obligation exists to destroy or de-identify data when it's no longer needed for the reason it was collected. Now, there's some carve-outs again to that. So if, for example, you have a legal obligation to keep it. So a great example that's often referred to is tax records. So a lot of companies need to maintain certain records for tax purposes, or other organisations might need to keep data because they're, say, in litigation and they can't destroy records relating to that litigation. So there can be a number of legal reasons why companies or anyone might need to hold on to some personal information. So that's really where we're at. We've got good I think personally, I think that is good legislation. The question around how do we make sure that legislation leads to good security practices, well, that really comes down to enforcement. And it's all good to have good laws in place, but if there's no one there to enforce them, then what's their value? And to that end, on the back of Optus and Medibank, and I've got some views on whether there's been breaches of APP 11 in both cases, but they're my personal views. While one of the sort of consequences of really Optus is that the government has just passed or has proposed, and it's gone through the House of Representatives, some legislation that seeks to amend the Privacy Act, and particularly the maximum penalties that can be imposed for breaches of the Act. So currently, the law is that penalties can be imposed of just over 2.2 million Australian dollars. That legislation is going to be amended, in my view, and is subject to Senate approval. That will change the maximum penalties that can be imposed to the higher of 50 million Australian dollars. This unusual measurement called 3 times the value of the benefit derived by the breach of the Privacy Act, which is confusing. And then this is the highlight for me, or 30% of a company's annual adjusted revenue if you can't figure out the value of the 3 times the value of the benefit. So the headline is 30% of a company's adjusted revenue is the maximum penalty that a company could be penalised for breaches of the Privacy Act. So how do you, bringing it back to the question, do we need more legislation? No, we might need to make some amendments. We're already on the way to doing that. It will really come down to enforcement, and if companies throughout Australia start seeing the regulators taking firm action against companies who breach the Privacy Act, then I imagine that others will fall into line reasonably quickly.
Thanks, Eden. And you speak very much to an important term there, and I had it written down before you said it, is accountability. It's great to have good laws, and it's great to have good guidance and good principles. But if there's no accountability, and if there's no consequence to not following those laws, that obviously then becomes a suggestion rather than a law, does it not? Right. So if we could move on from that, and I could actually spend a lot of time discussing that completely, but there's so many other things that I want to get through as well. Anusha, if I could loop you into the discussion here. Now, we spoke earlier about these gaps between our threat actors and our response to the threat actors. What are your views on the research gaps and the education gap that need attention?
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I completely agree with Aidan and Prashant around the data security, even though there has been a lot of measures in place, as we have seen with the Australian cybersecurity strategy 2020, which came out. It's still pretty much valid. Focus has been around countering the threats with the Five Eyes as well. So because I've been embedded in defence and federal government for a long time, I think the major gap that I'm seeing is educating the personnel, people who are working, not IT staff, because they are actually quite capable of understanding, what are the threats, or understanding if this thing looks like a scam. But I'm talking about somebody who's in HR or somebody who is an EA, and they're not really across like the criticalities of what email they're receiving and what links they should click onto. For example, I mean, if a HR lady receives a CV, she won't be able to tell if it's 10 pages long and where's the malware located. So while she's opening it, it's already going through the system. So like the other thing which I want to mention, that private companies do have a complex IT system, but if you look at Department of Defence or Department of Home Affairs, it's a beast. And the complexity of all the applications, of all the infrastructure they're running, and of all the data they have, it is extremely complex. And there's various partners who are managing it. There's various vendors, and how do we protect that? And it is amazing that ACS actually found that it's as simple as just patching your systems or upgrading your passwords, which people sometimes just fail to do, and it can just slip from, one person to the other. Or that person was on leave, and that was the only person who knew how to, was allocated that task to change the password on a firewall or something like that. But that slippage is there, and I think that's why I always think that automation of services is really important. Automating the services, going to secure clouds is really important, because that is where we really need to, it's basically in one area, so we can harness the activities which are going on, and that's really important for us. And data is the key. I mean, we've got personal information of people from all around the world. In Australia, we've got government officials, home addresses, their phone addresses, everything. So that is really critical, and data is the crown jewels. If you lose the data, that's it. And harnessing big data is also really critical for us. What data we use for our needs. So, for example, AFP will use different kind of data to ASIO, for example, which is the Australian Intelligence Organization. So there's a lot of things that we need to bring into place, but I think educating not only our staff or the government personnel, but also educating our youth, because we are working from home. COVID has changed the way we work around the world. So, we've got kids here who are playing with our phones or our PCs, and we need to understand that, there are vulnerabilities there, especially if you're connected to your home Wi-Fi. So there's vulnerabilities there, and if you are working in government, there are risks, and there has been a lot of breaches, which ACSC released a report saying that I think there were 500. No, sorry. This year, ACSC received over 76,000 crime reports, which is a 13% increase from the previous financial year. So, and it is because we're living in a hybrid working environment.
Absolutely, and you touched on so many valid points there, Anusha. One particularly being, highlighting that plight that cybersecurity is not a one-man show. It's not a one-man band. Everyone needs to be involved in it, and it is a team sport. So I'm going to ask the panel, and first one that wants to have a go at it can, as you all have expertise in this particular field. So if we look at it from a global and an international perspective, as we've got many members of the audience that have joined us from all, more specifically areas of the APAC, but literally all corners of the globe. Internationally, what is being done, and what more do you believe can be done to try and reduce the amount of cyber crime, cyber scams, and disinformation on the net? So the question is, has the horse bolted, or is it too late? And are we going to be continually playing catch up forever and a day? Or do you honestly believe that we can get to a stage where we can get on top of this, and we can, I wouldn't necessarily say get ahead of it, but get a grip on it so that we're not constantly chasing our tails and trying to keep up with just plugging holes wherever we can? Who wants to have the first go at that one?
Just going to add on to what Anush was saying before, and I guess talking about the global effort on tackling cybersecurity problems. So on one side, we look at Optus Medibank and the issues that government is escalating in terms of data security. But on the other side, we talk about skill shortage, and the government has cut down on the important skill set requirements, and as far as visa is concerned, and cybersecurity skill sets was one of them, which has been cut short from that list. So I don't know where we stand, but I guess the problem doesn't go away. Skill shortage is one thing, but I think internationally, one thing has to be recognized is at the university levels or school levels even, I think we're teaching theory in terms of cybersecurity, but this graduates, when they come out of the universities, I don't know how ready they are to tackle the real world problems. So I think that's the biggest gap from in my point of view that we need to tackle in terms of these graduates to be ready when they get into the workforce. But secondly, the problem is also escalating because, as you said, Dave, in your initial mention that a lot of cybersecurity professionals are leaving because of the stress and anxiety and stuff like that. So from my view, I think that's one of the key areas. And in my initial mention, I also said I'm here in Manila. I'm based in Sydney. I'm here in Manila, but we are doing an important session with the Australian ambassador for Philippines to talk about cybersecurity aspects. And that's one of the examples where, internationally, if the leaders within the states and countries can come together and exchange ideas in terms of what's happening in cybersecurity, I think that's one of the key things. Australia is on the forefront. In spite of, if we think Australia is still behind 5 years, in spite of that, Australia is on the forefront of exchanging ideas, collaborating with many other nations, specifically in Asia, where they're trying to bring the cybersecurity posture up to the mark in terms of what Australia does, and also learning from other countries. So I think that kind of collaboration, if it continues, and maybe more to the level where people are seeing it internationally, I think that will help quite a lot in terms of learning from each other, but also bolstering the cybersecurity requirements or controls collectively across all the nations.
Yeah, and I was just going to add to that when it comes to defence and intelligence and home affairs, the departments in Australia, they do collaborate quite heavily internationally to understand the best practices, lessons learned, which is really important. For example, Defence collaborates their threat intelligence with the Five Eyes. So the Five Eyes are like Canada, France, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, and they also share a lot of big programs which have been successfully implemented and successfully executed. But I think from Australia point of view, and as Minister Claire O'Neill mentioned, that we need to make sure to protect Australia that we focus on sovereignty, like data sovereignty, infrastructure sovereignty, supply chain sovereignty, and I think a lot of other countries are also looking at how sovereign is if for example, if you get a hardware from China, how sovereign is that? Because there's always a risk there. And that's why every time I've worked for defense, it has to be something that is either developed in US or in other countries. It can't really come from China. So I mean, there's that a lot of angst about how do we deliver best and mitigate the risk before it happens.
And that's exactly what we were talking about in terms of Presilience, isn't it, Anusha? Is how do we prevent the attack or reduce the likelihood of the attack happening before it actually happens? Before I close off that topic, just in terms of, do you believe that we are getting on top of it with all this hype and with all of this awareness from a legal perspective, or do we need you spoke about the legislation is good. We just need to now enforce it. Do you believe that we are getting on top of the situation, or is it running away with us? Do you believe that we'll ever catch up to it?
It's a really interesting question. It does seem like cyber is a bit of a game of whack-a-mole. So for those who don't know, it's sort of something pops up, you hit it, and then something pops up somewhere else, and you have to hit that, and then something else pops up. It's a constant game where I've certainly seen in my many years in the sector, attack types happen in a particular way. Defenses are developed against the common attack types, only to see the attack types evolve. And so the real current one that's at play is that for the last number of years, everyone's been singing about multi-factor authentication, or MFA, have to have MFA on all systems. That will prevent attacks. And yes, it does a great job in preventing a large number of attacks. But what I've now seen is there's, you know, the new attack type is MFA fatigue. So the cyber criminals are now, you know, exploiting the methods used for MFA to try and trick people or convince people into sort of clicking the OK button or handing over their code as a way to bypass MFA. You know, similarly, for a long time, you know, invoice scams or social engineering fraud relied on, you know, basically tricking people to sending money to the wrong bank account. A lot of cyber insurers or businesses started putting in place requirements or restrictions saying, you know, when someone changes bank accounts, you have to pick up the phone and call someone and confirm the bank details. So what do the criminals do? They know this, they learn this, so they then amend the emails so that the contact details, the call details that you call are really the criminal who obviously confirm the fraudulent bank account details. So it's, in my view, going to constantly evolve. I agree with the comment from Anush about Five Eyes. Really important information sharing goes on between governments. If you speak to anyone in that sector, in Department of Defence, that's what they'll tell you. And similarly, the privacy regulators in these countries talk a lot as well, and they want to know what's going on, how are different countries dealing with data protection. And so I think the collaboration between international agencies and regulators will improve things for the average individual and companies. But we are going to sort of, I think, in the long run, be in a constant game of developing defences to new methods of attack, and then seeing the criminals pivot and alter their attack types to counter the defences that are put in place.
And that segues with my very first job 20 odd years ago, and I was working in a managerial role, and the owner of the company, if I could just paint the picture, he was about, at that stage, he was an 80-year-old man who was about just over 5 foot tall, but he had about 500 people working for him in his company. I was one of them, and he knew every single person by name, by the way. And he was a very wise man. And he came to me one day, and we had our weekly chats and he shared his wisdom and his insights with me. And he said to me, "Dave, you're never going to catch a criminal." And I said to him, "Of course I will. Why won't I catch a criminal?" And he said to me, "Because you spend 90% of your day working and 10% of your day thinking how you're going to catch them, where the criminals spend 90% of their day thinking how they're going to steal from you and 10% of their day working." So to your point, Eden, I think, you know, that game of whack-a-mole quite aptly sums up where we seem to be at the moment. If I could move the discussion slightly, insurance seems to be another hot topic. And, you know, Eden, I'm going to start off with you, and then Anusha and Prashant, from a business perspective as well, I'd like you to jump in on this one. So the stats are quite alarming with regards to insurance, with regards to getting insurance. So the statistic that was that's been released at the moment is that only 25% of companies have cyber insurance, right? The other 75% of companies either potentially don't believe they need cyber insurance, or aren't able to get cyber insurance, or don't even know that something like cyber insurance exists. And then we focus on, and then we look at the 25% of organizations that do have cyber insurance. Is that a sort of sleep easy for them? Do you believe that it's a necessary part of the remediation process for them? How do you sort of fit cyber insurance into the plan of cyber resilience? And how much is enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. Starting with your last question, because there's a few in there. Starting with your last question first. No. It's I mean, I specialize in cyber insurance. I have cyber insurers as clients. I have good relationships with cyber insurance brokers, underwriters, people who work in cyber insurance claims. So, and I have done for many years. So this is a topic I talk regularly about. Starting with how much is enough. That really depends on the size and complexity of the organization. It depends on how much the organization can afford to spend on insurance. So that's really, there's no one size fits all. I've seen policies with limits of $25,000. I've seen policies with limits of $200 million. So, and everything in between. It really depends on the organization. Is cyber insurance a good thing? Absolutely. Every company in Australia and probably globally should at least assess whether it's appropriate for them. And what I mean by that is that for some companies will ultimately decide that it's not, some companies will decide making an informed business decision that it's not right for them. That's ultimately a business decision. But insurance for me is the same for cyber as it is for any other product line. It is a really important risk transfer mechanism. It's a risk transfer tool. So it is something that I recommend all companies consider carefully. No, companies shouldn't just go to sleep easy at night because they've got cyber insurance. The same way, you don't sort of take your seatbelt off and not worry about servicing your car and drive recklessly and do all of those things just because you've got car insurance. That's not how it works. Car insurance or home insurance are great analogies when it comes to cyber insurance. So if you have home and contents insurance, it doesn't mean you leave your front door open, leave the windows unlocked, and just pray for the best that the robbers aren't going to come in and leave all your expensive jewelry and technical equipment in the sight of anyone who walks past the open windows. That's not a great idea. You have that insurance there as a last resort, but you still go in, make sure your doors are locked. You might put bars on your windows. You might install an alarm system. You might get CCTV footage at your home. You still go and take your car for a service every year. It's the same thing with cyber insurance. Companies should be putting in place really good systems to log what's going on in their network, to keep people out, to know what happens if someone breaks in, to be able to identify what they've actually done. It's sort of like the CCTV footage. If someone manages to break into your house, you want cameras to see exactly what rooms they've gone in. You want audio, you want the picture to be clear. So that sort of logging, you need to have all of those things in place. But if they ultimately get in and steal stuff, that's where the insurance is there. It's the last resort. It's there as the safety net to help. And I've seen several companies sort of saved, literally going to go out of business because of attacks, but they've been saved by their cyber insurers stepping in, helping with, restoration of damaged systems, helping out deal with the regulatory fallout and helping out, with the number of things that can come from a cyber attack. So yeah, I think cyber insurance is an excellent product that every company should be considering. It's not, you don't lead with cyber insurance, it's there at the very end as a last resort. You lead with good systems, good security, good practices, good procedures, and good training.
I just wanted to ask you, Eden, like while you were talking about cyber insurance, because I've actually seen and been involved in the espionage of a lot of cyber attacks. So once the data is encrypted, and that's what they're doing, the cyber criminals. What do you think cyber insurance will do? Because we are looking at very critical things like, information, data, but cyber insurance, and also most of the cyber criminals will ask for ransom. So I always say that cyber criminals, there's three things they do. Like one is asking for ransom, and the other one is like destroying your reputation or steal classified documents or information. And I'm talking from the government point of view. So I just want to understand, like, if it is insurance, if the data is already encrypted, they can have the best tech, and it's just the way they do things.
Yeah, so cyber insurance, and obviously it's subject to the terms and conditions of the specific policy. But if I speak at a very high general level about what sort of things cyber insurance will cover, if you can try and say decrypt the encrypted data, the cost of going and engaging the company to try and do that type of cost could be covered. If you've got backups and you need to then go and restore them, and you need to bring in extra resources because you're already under an attack and everyone's already working at full steam. But if you need to bring in additional resources to help with restoring systems from backups, those costs are typically covered under a cyber insurance policy. If a ransom is demanded, the cost of the ransom payment and any experts engaged to assist with ransom negotiations, that can be covered under a cyber insurance policy. So there are a lot of things that cyber insurance can cover to assist companies when they are under attack and their data's been encrypted.
All right, okay, that explains it well. Thank you.
I'm actually going to contradict slightly Eden, but it's nothing wrong there, but it's just the industry perspective, I guess, as to what we're seeing. So we get involved with many end organizations to prepare them to get a cyber insurance policy in terms of doing assessment, testing, etc. Just like how you would test your doors and locks and windows, that's what we do, test them first, and then based on that, the insurance premium is decided. But I think there is a lot of gap in the industry in terms of understanding the insurance policies, what are the requirements. So much so that I've spoken to many big organizations where they've gone through the policies over and over again, and then they just gave up at some point saying it's too hard to fill up all this information. And there is a point where they can't fill up this information other than having experts like us. And I'm not saying we are expert in writing cyber insurance policy or filling up the documents, but it's just that the information that they find there is too technical and then they give it up. And I spoke to one of the organizations last week where they're going through the cyber insurance policy documents, and they went through like few rounds, 2 weeks, just filling up the documents, and the amount of time they spent on writing all that. They said, oh, if you calculate the time, it might as well not take the policy and just wait for something to happen. So there is a mixed reaction, I guess, in between many organizations, depending on where they come. But I think it all comes down to the maturity of the organization as well, and how much they understand their own port or walls or ceilings and locks in terms of filling up that information. But on the other side, I've seen some positive side of things as well, where many organizations have taken that policy, formed a panel of their own in terms of going through the rigor of, if an attack happens, how do we tackle that, who are on the panel to help us with the incident response, forensic investigation, so on and so forth. So yeah, it's a mixed bag for me, to be honest, but I think at least in Australia, the market for cyber insurance, we haven't got to that stage, in my opinion, where people understand what it can do for you and people just take it. There is no convincing needed, but in Australia, at least, we have a lot of convincing to do when it comes to cyber insurance policies. Yeah.
I might just sort of jump in there. I actually agree with most of the things you've just said there. That is my experience, that some companies do find the process to be too difficult. My response to that is, that sort of good insurance broker is there to assist with. It is important to engage sort of lawyers who understand the policies, IT experts who can help get systems to a point where they're ready to be insured. And yes, the questions today from most insurers are a lot more detailed than they were a few years ago. A few years ago, it was, a couple pages, fill out some very basic information, select how much insurance you want, and the premiums would be reasonably inexpensive. But what's happened from, say, 2016 to 2022, an epidemic of ransomware, major data breaches, serious amounts of social engineering fraud and business email compromise. And it's the insurers, amongst others, who have really paid for it. And so naturally, what happens when you see massive amounts of claims and expensive claims coming in, the insurers have had to become more considered in their underwriting process and, really assessing what types of companies, what sectors, and what level of security they consider to be the baseline before they're prepared to give out a product, to give out insurance. When you think about it, insurers are in the business of writing insurance, so that their whole business model is about writing insurance policies. So, if a company's being told, no, you can't get insurance, then, that's sort of like going to register your car and being told for third-party insurance, renewing your car insurance, renewing your car insurance and being told, no, your car's not roadworthy. And so to me, that's a wake-up call to companies to say, well, maybe we don't have the systems in place that are good enough for the current risk climate that we all live in. And so they should be speaking to experts around, IT experts around how do we get our systems to a place where the insurance companies will actually sell us a policy.
And insurance is something that's very, very close to my heart, and I could discuss it all day because I think that there's so many different topics and there's so many different on-ramps and off-ramps to be discussed, but conscious of time as well. There's a lovely question that's come through from the audience. Rachel's asked the question, hi everyone, I've spoken to a number of my own clients who claim that everyone pays when it comes to ransomware. Right. However, Medibank declined to pay and has had data released. Do any of you have insights to the outcomes if payment is made, e.g. do the criminals do the right thing, or do they take the ransom and release the data anyway? So, so my opinion is no criminal has a conscience, and otherwise there wouldn't be a criminal in the beginning. But I wasn't asked the question, the experts were asked the question, so I'm going to throw it out to the panel. Do criminals have a conscience, and will they give back your data if they paid ransomware? And what are your views on ransomware?
Not in my opinion.
Yeah, it's I mean, there's a lot of ifs and buts, I guess, in that particular question. But conscious, no. Have I seen people paying it? Yes. But they have, when they paid for the right or the wrong reason, they went and checked a few things about the organization, criminal organization who was asking for this payment, believe it or not, to test the integrity. But as a cybersecurity company ourselves, we always say not to pay, and there are multiple options to test out before we even go down that path, I guess. But yeah, it's a long, convoluted response to that question, but it's a difficult one to tackle. I also read somewhere that Australia is coming up with some requirement. Maybe Eden knows about this, where there is some legislation coming, and I don't know how true this is, but some legislation coming where organizations will be forced not to pay for all these ransomware demands that come in. I don't know when it's coming. At least in in the US, there are some talks about this, but I think it's important that we put something like that. But it only is true when you go ahead and do something of that sort, and then it eventually the data is released or unencrypted. I have seen that for at least 2 clients where they have paid and released, but again, there was a lot of discussions and background checks done before they did that. But I have seen more organizations not paying, but still managed to tackle that particular incident.
I might just add a few comments there. I've spoken to a number of leading organizations about this, both insurers, tech experts, ransom negotiation companies. The statistics range from anywhere from say 20% of companies pay all the way up to 80% of companies pay. My sense is that it's probably around 1/3 of companies, about 1/3 of companies hit with ransomware pay. So not everyone pays. It might be slightly higher than that. Do criminals do what they say they're going to do? Each criminal group is different. So you really need to think about the cyber criminal industry as like any other industry. You'll have main players, and then you'll have, startups, you'll have SMEs. It's a proper industry, if you will. If you think about it, some criminals will not do what they say they're going to do. They're just criminals. They're blatantly, they're not going to honor what they say. The bigger groups generally do what they say they're going to do because it's in their interest to do that. The bigger criminal groups need people to trust them. And if they say that they're going to delete the data, they need to delete the data, because if they don't do that and they don't establish trust, why would you ever pay them again? Their business model is to obtain money from ransom payments. So it's critical for them to establish trust. That's why when Medibank said they weren't going to pay, it was very obvious they were going to release the data. If they didn't, why would you pay them next time? They had to release the data. It was always going to happen. Medibank didn't pay and Optus didn't pay because it was so public, but a lot of companies will pay to prevent data from being published. And in many instances, that's exactly how I've seen things play out. Company does the payment, data is not released. There's a bigger question. I'm mindful of the time. There's a bigger question about whether it's legal. I have not heard of Australia outlawing ransom payments. We've talked about just requiring disclosure to the government that you've paid a ransom in certain situations. In the US, some states have outlawed it. Those states still have ransom payments happening. You're now criminalizing victims making payments to try and save their companies. So there's a real ethical debate around whether it's a good or a bad thing. I don't think we're going to have time in the 1 minute we've got left to get into that. But what I'll say is that there's a real question. The first question always with ransomware, is it legal to pay? That's what lawyers advise on, and then you really start moving. If it is legal, then you start moving to should you pay, and that's really a commercial decision based on the circumstances of the incident.
Mindful of time, and I think this is really an important question, and I'm going to ask you all for one word, essentially. So if you think about this one, Anonymous has asked the question, and I think it's a really important question. What do you think is the most important thing small and medium-sized businesses should do to protect themselves from cyber attacks? So if I could just go around the room and ask you for one aspect without an explanation, unfortunately, because we don't have the time to get into it at this point, but what do you believe that small to medium-sized organizations can take away from this webinar that they can go and practically apply to their businesses to make them one step more mature tomorrow morning? Anusha, if I could start with you.
Yeah, hardening their system and applying all the patches.
Fantastic. Prashant?
I'm just going to use the saying, know what you manage and manage what you know. So as long as you know all your data, where it is and how it is and who's accessing it, then put appropriate controls based on the risks.
Plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Fantastic. And unfortunately, there are so many more topics that I'd love to cover, and unfortunately, I've had to cut you short on so many topics, but I just really want to round off by thanking Prashant, Anusha, Eden, and our panelists off camera, our guests off camera, Dr. Gav Schneider, Dr. Dave Rubens, and of course, it goes without saying, our fantastic production team in the wings, Janita Shang and Amanda Wilson, who has very successfully put this incredible event together, all the marketing, all the posts, the banners that you see behind you, all the correspondence with our guests. You guys have once again done an absolutely fantastic job, and I really appreciate it. And without any further ado, I'm going to thank you all for your time. Of course, to our wonderful audience for giving of your time, joining us, for your questions, for your input, for your knowledge. Please, the ISRM journal, annual journal is out. The link will be posted shortly. You can download the link in the link portal. It's an incredible journal of information. It's in the chat box as well. Thank you, Amanda, for posting that. Download your copy of the ISRM journal. Join the Cybersecurity Special Interest Group on LinkedIn. Please keep the conversation going. Keep making a difference. As our panelists have all agreed today, cybersecurity is a team sport. We can't do it alone. We need a collaborative effort from a global perspective to try and get on top of what we have. To all our guests, to all our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, have a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening.